So it starts off like this.
And you know what
Hi,
I'm talking
besties.
about here on my
Welcome
channel.
back to my channel.
Right
And
now.
right away the tone is very familiar. Like we're stepping back into another breakdown where things in this ongoing legal situation around Blake Lively are being unpacked piece by piece. The creator jumps in with a strong claim that Blake Lively has just been completely embarrassed in court. But instead of going straight into the legal details, there's this long emotional detour that sets the tone for everything that follows. Before even touching what happened in court, there's a pause to talk about someone referred to as Shasty. And the way this is framed, Shasty is being positioned as a journalist who has allegedly been dragged through an intense and prolonged period of criticism, misrepresentation, and online backlash. According to the narrator, this has gone on for close to 2 years, with claims that she was portrayed in a very negative light by certain fans and PR narratives surrounding Blake Lively. The narrator is very firm about their interpretation of Shasty's actions, insisting that she wasn't acting on instructions from anyone like Melissa Nathan or any other PR figure. Instead, they're saying she made her own independent choice to post a video that showed Blake acting in a way she personally didn't like during an interview. The reasoning given is that it came from her own reaction to Blake's behavior, especially in relation to how Blake was handling the marketing and public relations side of a film. They also emphasized that this wasn't some coordinated attack, but rather something personal and reactive based on Shasty's own experiences and impressions. In this version of events, Shasty is being framed not as a malicious actor, but as someone responding to what she observed and felt in real time. The narrator pushes back strongly against the idea that she was part of any orchestrated smear campaign. From there, the discussion shifts into a broader commentary about what happens when individuals speak publicly about celebrities. The narrator brings up how fandom culture can become extremely aggressive, especially when it comes to high-profile figures. They argue that people often stay silent about negative experiences involving celebrities because they fear backlash from fans. To illustrate this, they mention Taylor Swift's fandom as an example of how intense online communities can become. The point being made is that large, loyal fanbases can create an environment where criticism feels unsafe or discouraged, leading people to remain quiet about their experiences until the situation changes, or they feel more protected in speaking out. The narrator uses this to explain why, in their view, people eventually begin to speak up once they feel the environment is less hostile. They describe it as a kind of shift in timing where individuals feel safer coming forward because they believe they won't be immediately attacked or discredited. Shasty is again framed as someone who has continued to speak publicly despite pressure, and the narrator expresses approval of her decision not to retract or soften her stance. They describe her as consistent and not easily intimidated, suggesting that she has chosen to maintain her version of events even in the face of criticism. But the tone shifts again when the focus returns to Blake Lively and the legal situation. The narrator references a recent development where there was talk of a settlement. However, they quickly question the simplicity of that idea, suggesting that even when settlements are reported, the underlying legal tension doesn't necessarily disappear. Blake is described as having sent a lengthy letter to the court after the settlement discussion, asking for attorney's fees and permission to file additional arguments. The narrator summarizes this as Blake essentially trying to extend her legal position even after major parts of the case had been resolved or dismissed. At this point, the narrator introduces a response from the opposing side, specifically referencing a letter sent by Wayfarer's legal representation. The letter is described in detail, with emphasis on how it frames Blake's request as unnecessary or procedurally unwarranted. According to the narrator's reading, Wayfarer's legal team points out that Blake had agreed to a settlement where she dismissed her remaining claims without receiving any monetary damages from the $300 million she had initially sought. Despite that, she was still requesting further briefing and legal consideration regarding attorney's fees and related procedural matters. The narrator highlights a footnote mentioned in the letter, which clarifies that not all related legal issues were fully resolved by the settlement. Specifically, another complaint involving a third party was still pending. This is used to show that the legal landscape was more complicated than a simple case-closed narrative. The explanation then moves into legal language around California's Section 47, which deals with attorneys' fees and protections in defamation-related cases. The narrator reads through portions of the legal reasoning, emphasizing how it defines when a defendant may be entitled to recover costs, if they successfully defend themselves against certain types of claims. This section becomes very dense with references to motions, procedural history, and prior court decisions. The narrator explains that Wayfarer had previously attempted to get relief under this statute, and that parts of their request had been denied without prejudice, meaning they were allowed to refile later. They walk through how the motion was renewed, briefed, and discussed again before trial, and how Blake's side did not initially request additional briefing. The implication being made is that the request for more time or more argument came later, after key decisions had already been made or after certain claims had been dismissed. The narrator emphasizes that Wayfarer's legal position is that they do not need further briefing to decide whether Blake is entitled to the relief she is seeking. They argue that the court already has enough information to make a determination. This leads into a more interpretive commentary from the narrator, who begins questioning the logic of requesting damages or attorney's fees after the underlying claims have already been dismissed. They raise the idea that if a case is no longer active in the same way, it becomes difficult to justify additional monetary claims tied to defending it. The tone becomes more analytical and skeptical as they suggest that the repeated requests for additional briefing may be more about extending the argument or maintaining leverage rather than introducing genuinely new legal necessity. They also speculate about whether the push for attorney's fees is coming directly from Blake or is being driven more heavily by her legal team. The narrator suggests there may be a strategic or financial motivation behind continuing to pursue these requests, especially if payment structures like contingency arrangements are involved. From their perspective, this creates tension between legal strategy and actual case merit, with repeated filings and requests being interpreted as attempts to secure a favorable narrative or financial outcome. The court response is then described very briefly but significantly. The judge does not require additional briefing at this time and issues a simple order stating as much. The narrator interprets this as a strong, decisive signal that the court is not interested in prolonging that specific procedural argument. They frame the judge's response as direct and dismissive of unnecessary extensions, suggesting that the court already understands the procedural posture of the case well enough to proceed without further submissions. At this point, the narrator reflects on the broader pattern they believe they are seeing in the case. They argue that many of the arguments being made have already been raised previously, and that the legal reasoning has been consistent across rulings. They suggest that the court has already indicated certain claims do not meet the required legal standard, and that prior motions have already addressed similar issues. This is used to support the idea that revisiting the same arguments may not change the outcome. The narrator then shifts into a more personal commentary style, discussing how they interpret the overall legal strategy and what they believe is happening behind the scenes. They suggest that some of the filings read more like attempts to shape public perception or secure a symbolic win rather than achieve a clear legal victory. This leads into a broader discussion about legal narratives, public relations, and how high-profile cases often play out simultaneously in court and in the media. The narrator implies that part of the dispute is not just legal, but also reputational. They also mention commentary from other media voices who have described the situation in terms of public relations battles and narrative control. The idea being explored is that different sides of the case are trying to frame outcomes in ways that support their broader image, regardless of the strict legal result. As the first part begins to wind down, the narrator returns to the idea that Blake's side is seeking recognition or validation in some form, even as parts of the case have been dismissed or resolved without financial award. They question how success is being defined in this context. The argument being developed is that there is a disconnect between legal outcomes and public narratives, where dismissal of claims is being reframed in different ways depending on perspective. The narrator ends this section by signaling skepticism about the strength of the claims for damages or attorney's fees, suggesting that the court's responses so far indicate limited interest in expanding the scope of those arguments. They close part 1 by setting up that there is still more to unpack regarding the court's handling of the case, the legal reasoning behind the decisions, and how each side is attempting to interpret the outcome in their favor. Continuing from where things left off, the focus shifts deeper into how the legal arguments are being interpreted and what the court's responses actually mean in the broader structure of this case. The narrator continues unpacking the letter submitted by Wayfarer's legal team, emphasizing how strongly they push back against Blake Lively's request for additional briefing and expanded consideration of attorney's fees. The core argument being highlighted is simple in legal terms. but heavily debated in interpretation. If the main claims in a case have already been dismissed or resolved, then trying to reopen procedural questions about costs, damages, or additional arguments becomes significantly harder to justify unless there is a clear legal basis. According to the narration, Wayfarer's position is that no such basis has been properly established here. They point out that Blake's request does not clearly explain why new briefing would even be necessary at this stage. The legal filings, as described, argue that nothing in the court's later rulings fundamentally changes the procedural reality of what has already been decided. In other words, the dismissal of key claims remains the central fact, and subsequent developments do not automatically reopen those issues. The narrator repeatedly stresses that Wayfarer's legal team is essentially saying the same thing in different ways. The court already has enough information, and there is no need to extend the process further just to revisit arguments that have already been addressed. This is framed as an attempt to prevent what they see as unnecessary procedural expansion. There is also emphasis on the idea that Blake's side is trying to introduce impact of intervening rulings as a justification for more argument, but the opposing side is questioning what that actually means in practical terms. They argue that once the primary claims are dismissed, the legal foundation for further expansion becomes very limited. The narration then moves into a more interpretive layer again, where the creator begins analyzing motivation rather than just procedure. They suggest that repeated requests for further briefing may not be purely about legal necessity, but also about controlling narrative direction or keeping certain arguments active for strategic reasons. From this perspective, the legal filings are not just about winning or losing a motion, but about maintaining leverage in a broader dispute that also includes public perception. The narrator repeatedly returns to the idea that high-profile cases often operate on two levels: courtroom rulings and media interpretation. The discussion then circles back to the judge's response, which is described as brief and decisive. The court states that no additional briefing is required at this time and issues a straightforward order. The narrator interprets this as the court signaling that it does not see value in prolonging procedural debate on this specific issue. That judicial response becomes a key anchor point in the narration. It is used to suggest that the court is prioritizing efficiency and clarity over extended argument, especially on matters where prior rulings and filings already provide a sufficient record. From there, the narrator expands into a broader reflection on what they believe the case demonstrates about legal strategy in high-profile disputes. They suggest that when claims are dismissed or resolved, attempts to reframe the outcome through additional filings or narrative explanations can sometimes clash with how courts actually operate. They emphasize that courts tend to focus on legal standards, procedural posture, and evidentiary support, rather than narrative framing or public perception. So even if one side attempts to present developments as significant, the court may view them as legally irrelevant to the specific motion at hand. The narration also revisits the idea of attorney's fees under Section 47. 1. Explaining again in simplified terms that such provisions are designed to compensate defendants who successfully defend against certain types of claims. However, the narrator suggests that applying this in a situation where claims have already been dismissed creates complexity in determining what is actually compensable. They discuss how the opposing side is essentially arguing that it is unclear how later developments could increase costs for defending claims that are no longer active in the same legal sense. This becomes a central tension point in the argument being presented. The narrator highlights language from the letter that questions the logic of requesting further briefing about issues that, in their view, should already be settled based on the procedural history of the case. The idea is that once dismissal has occurred, the legal scope narrows significantly. At this stage, the tone becomes more analytical and less descriptive of filings, shifting into commentary about consistency and coherence in legal strategy. The narrator suggests that repeatedly asking for additional steps after dismissal can appear redundant unless a very specific legal reason is established. They also return to the idea that both sides have previously made strong claims about retaliation, defamation, and procedural misconduct, but that courts have already ruled on many of those issues in earlier motions. This is used to reinforce the idea that much of what is being reintroduced has already been addressed in some form. The discussion then expands into a broader interpretation of litigation dynamics, where one side seeks monetary recovery while the other side focuses on limiting exposure and controlling liability. The The narrator suggests that this creates natural tension in how each motion is framed and argued. There is also reflection on how legal teams construct arguments over time, often revisiting earlier rulings and trying to connect them to current procedural requests. The narrator frames this as a standard part of litigation strategy, but also notes that courts may not always find these connections persuasive. As the explanation continues, the narrator again emphasizes the judge's brief order as a key indicator of how the court is currently viewing the situation. The lack of need for further briefing is interpreted as a sign that the court believes it already has sufficient clarity on the issue. From there, the narrative begins to widen into a more general commentary about perception versus outcome. The narrator suggests that in high-profile legal disputes, parties often attempt to frame partial or procedural outcomes as larger victories or setbacks depending on their perspective. They also mention commentary from outside observers who have described the situation as heavily influenced by public relations strategy, where social media statements and public narratives run parallel to court filings. This is presented as part of the modern legal media environment. The narrator then briefly revisits the idea that settlements or dismissals are sometimes portrayed differently depending on who is speaking, with each side emphasizing aspects that support their interpretation of success. In this framing, legal resolution does not always translate into a single, universally accepted narrative outcome. Toward the final section, the narrator reflects again on their belief that the court is unlikely to grant expanded relief based on the current procedural posture. They suggest that the judge's earlier rulings already set boundaries around what can and cannot be recovered under the claims being discussed. They also reiterate that attempts to secure additional briefing or reconsideration appear to have been addressed directly by the court's simple denial of further procedural expansion. That moment is treated as a concluding signal in their interpretation. The overall takeaway presented in this section is that the legal process is being tightly managed by the court, with limited interest in extending arguments beyond what is necessary to resolve the remaining procedural questions. The narrator frames this as a sign of judicial efficiency and clarity. Finally, the discussion closes with a return to broader commentary on the case as a whole. The narrator reiterates their belief that the situation is being interpreted in multiple ways depending on perspective, but that the actual legal outcomes so far are relatively clear in terms of dismissed claims and unresolved procedural limits. The final tone is reflective and opinion-based, emphasizing skepticism about attempts to reframe dismissed claims as ongoing leverage. The narrator leaves viewers with the impression that the court's current stance is firm, and that further attempts to expand briefing or revisit resolved issues are